the San Diego game, well, yeah, it's that there you have it's kind of a nice blend of the two because you do have these different groups, but every single individual is sort of struggling in the grip of the difficulties that their group faces. So they are going to be very individualized in their opinion about it and their actions that they take. Um, so again, we only have 2 sessions on that one. I can't speak for sure about how that is going to look in the fullness of
Mhm.
time. And I really hope that that ends up being very much a many sessioned game with a rapidly expanding cast and a rapidly expanding set of setting events.
Oh. Sorry to follow up with this, but because you mentioned that, I don't want
No, go ahead.
to. But do you? Um, is your thoughts with that to allow that rapidly expanding cast to come organically out of the 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 resolution, or do you of the individual of the kind of the situation you're in now, or do you have sort of ideas for like, okay, I'd like to see. I've got some other characters off stage that.
Yeah, there's so many things happening in that location that
Yeah.
it in some ways it's a bit of both.
Okay.
In the I do have other active entities who have actually been mentioned obliquely in previous dialogues. So they
Okay.
have connections to some of the people that we've met. We just haven't had them walk in and be obvious yet.
Right. Right.
Um, whereas there are other things. I mean, the the actions of the character um, Jose Milero in actually letting the militant Degueño guy go, the guy who swiped the money from the Mexican army,
Mm-hmm.
actually letting him go with the money was so shocking to that character that what he's going to go do and whom he's going to speak to are way different than what he would have done under any other circumstances.
Right.
So
That
all
makes
of a
sense.
sudden, I have to think about the person that I know he's going to speak to, who I actually have named in my notes, along with the note to myself. My notes to myself sometimes are hilarious in retrospect when I look at them at some distance. And underneath it, it's written, no small potato, which
Okay.
so so I've already tagged this character as having all kinds of weight right in the setting,
Right.
but now Cristobal is going to go off and tell her things that Cristobal never dreamed he would ever be saying, and that person is completely unprepared for.
Mm-hmm.
So
Okay.
all of a sudden I'm playing this character off screen, undergoing massive reorientation.
That makes sense.
Yeah, so I mean that's the clearly that has a very sorcerer-esque feel to it for me.
Right. That makes sense. Okay. Interesting. Okay.
So my question back is,
Mm-hmm.
all right, I know I'm focusing way in on, uh, the your character sheets.
Oh, that's.
Um,
Yeah.
so death, 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 and more death. How do you
Yeah.
die?
So that. Yeah. Let me bring up. So that character was Eden Carter, and she. Um, the circumstances of that were she was it was a pretty intense combat scene that had come about fairly, it sort of come out organically that all of the characters were in the same spot, and it made and one they all the characters were in the same spot, and the one of the main bad guys was in the same spot, and it was very nice because none of it had been. It wasn't. None of it was like forced or kind of set up or planned. It just was like, I guess this is where they'd
Mm-hmm.
be going, and and the player had his character Eden follow along, and so we had this really great confrontation between where the bad guy at the time, and at the time the bad guy had control of the dragon. So this is kind of interesting. So Jean Jacques was on one side with his soldiers, and Eden was coming from the other direction, and she didn't have. She was kind of undercover, and so was kind of sneaking around. And Eden and Jean Jacques didn't know each other, but they were both sort of the equivalent of kind of fighting for the British Empire type guys. And the bad guy was a former British East India Company officer who had deserted that and set up a mercenary army of his own, and he had also gotten control of this dragon. So they were coming. They were kind of Eden's job was to kind of capture this guy, and Jean Jacques had some other military goals that just happened to this guy just happened to be opposing him, but wasn't specifically Jean Jacques didn't have any specifically thing against this guy. He
No,
just
I'm
was.
with you though, but the Tarantino moment has come and everybody's pointing their guns at each other, and it's right.
Yeah, or their dragons and their spells and everything,
Yeah.
and so Eden. So so we had kind of established that you know that it's sort of established that Eden was kind of sneaking into this confrontation. Meanwhile, the kind of bad guy mercenary with the dragon was going to attack Jean Jacques' forces, and they were going to get in this big fight. And Eden, the player had Eden sort of reveal herself and then charge kind of into this battle, um, drawing the attention of the dragon specifically, and uh, we kind of knew when that failed that you just charged a dragon
Yeah.
by yourself
I've
all
been
alone, and
pretty
we're kind of
good.
like,
I've been pretty
I,
good about sticking to the rule of you say beforehand whether failure is going to be, you know, a real disaster for you. I've been
and I
pretty
think we
good
had
about
said
that.
that we
Yeah.
were like, we did say like, this is the dragon, you're going alone, and he's like, yes,
Mm-hmm.
she's going alone.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this is what she needs to do, and so we definitely had said this was a big deal, and she went ahead with it. Failed the roll, failed this roll with a lot of dice.
Oh
Um,
yeah, yeah, that happens.
which is, and especially for this role was sort of, and then we, um, Eden took took that monologue of death victory, so kind of had attacked the dragon, had kind of turned on her, and but took the that kind of monologue of death victory to take the bad guy out with her
Right,
as she died.
right, uh-huh,
So
right. No,
using
it's
that rather than trying to kind of get the dice, and we had been going, I know there's been this, you have discussed that the initial death rules of kind of, you've got to have your friends give you the other players have to give you the
yeah.
pool
You
dice,
can
and they don't come
only
back
use
even
your
if they
pool dice. You
succeed,
can't
and
use
it's,
traits.
well, we had planned, well, we didn't need to, we followed the rules, but we didn't need to get to that second
Right,
level of,
right,
what if you don't want to die,
right,
because
right,
Eden's player said like, actually I want that monologue of
right,
victory in death, and that's a satisfying,
right.
although I mean it was meaningful, but it was a satisfying ending to that character. So uh but we didn't get into this like, oh,
Right.
should, does Jean Jacques have to give up his pool dice to
Right.
save Eden or anything like that?
Right, and then whatever those dice are rolled, no one ever gets them back. They're all
No one
going to
gets
be
them back.
gone.
Yeah.
Yeah, I found it. Okay, you mentioned those as the initial rules, and I'm going to. I know what you mean, but I'm going to be clear as possible that this is at least the third pool that came along, if not more than that. So, therefore, I think it's the first one, maybe. I'll have to double check because I still don't think I have a full chain of all the different ones. And I'm not even sure I
Mm.
really care because I
Yeah.
want to play a game that works. And James never played it. So I don't really credit any of these manuscripts as being an actual game. I'm
Yeah. Yeah.
getting pretty ferocious about that point. So, therefore, I look at those rules. In fact, here's what happened in the frog game. I actually hadn't reviewed the rules for that and was under the impression that it was basically, well, if you fail the death, I mean, if you fail a lethal situation, you get one more roll. That's kind of what I had in my head.
Right, right.
And it was just, an ordinary roll. And then when we started doing it, you can actually see in the video, they have to correct me and explain the rules to me. And I'm like, huh, what? Durr, right? What are we playing? Right. And so I say, oh, I guess it works like that. And I'm reading the rules and I'm going, you gotta be fucking kidding me.
Yeah.
That's ridiculous.
It,
Who dreamed up that shit? So yeah, I basically just sharpied that, right out of there. I haven't really come up with much of an alternative except to go with what I sort of thought the way you did it at the time, which is that you designate a role as lethal when,
mhm.
before it's rolled. And if they fail, then they do get basically a death save. But it's an ordinary roll. They
Yeah,
can,
makes sense.
they can use their traits and whatever. Um, I mean, it's a little painful if you just blew your whole pool on that particular roll. So now you don't have any pool dice to put in it, but, them's the breaks. Um, so anyway, though, that kind of answers my question, about how you guys did
Yeah.
it.
And I think for this game we're going to continue with that rule, even though it's kind of terrible, just for consistency. And will say that I do think that option of like taking the death but getting that extra monologue of victory
Right.
is pretty meaningful. So
Yeah.
I think that is something to
Right.
maybe I would want to continue to have that in some capacity
It's a good
as
idea.
I kind of play with it going forward.
Yeah.
And also, I agree with you, making the alternative be less brutal.
Mhm.
If you want to try to save, then at least it's not so
There is
terrible an option.
there is one other thing that's also worth considering because it is actually viable by the rules, which is for the GM or everybody, given that initial, setup of information, to just look at it and say, do characters die in this or not? Because
Yes.
since it is
Yes.
the GM's designation as to whether any given role is potentially lethal, you could just front load it by saying my answer is just universally no
Right.
and proceed. I mean, you could
Yeah.
do that. Since you narrate the outcomes of defeat, you can make defeats in those circumstances quite crushing.
Yeah.
And basically hammer the character pretty badly, and just leave it at that, and just say, okay, it's just one of those stories where they don't die. I mean, that is actually technically quite possible by the rules as written.
Yes, that's a good point.
So, I mean, if anybody's really like wigged out about death while playing the pool, just do that.
And I don't think I guess I think it's very interesting what you can do to kind of with not I don't want to say like even tweaks because it's not necessarily as you say changing the rules really, but tuning them
Right.
to really fit the kind of idiom and the tone. There's just a lot of opportunity for that. I mean, it's
Yeah, I mean, you could have a very brutal game where death is quite frequent, and you end up with
yeah,
trading like characters in and out. The game is also kind of interestingly open to the possibility of um, how. I mean, it just doesn't say. So remember, it's coming very much out of a Moldvay, BX D&D background,
mm,
and that was coming from an era when I think people still were playing a certain number of times. They'd play multiple characters.
yep,
And that, not that this was ever mentioned in the context of the pool, but the notion that if your character bit the dust, we shed a tear and play does continue and you
yeah,
continue. There isn't, you know, it's not a deal breaker.
yeah,
That's kind of part of it. There's, um, I think that I would in time like to either play in or GM, play in if preferable, if possible, a fairly standard role play at least fantasy heartbreaker grade of fantasy, with the presumption of adventurers, delving into dark and, desperate places, um, fully on board.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the game is perfectly robust for that purpose, and
Yeah.
there's no reason on earth you know, why you can't play it with plenty of fun for that.
Yeah, that
Um,
makes sense.
and I kind of,
Yeah.
you may have noticed that, I'm trying to demystify the pool a lot,
Yeah.
as much as I can. So that might be one of the strongest ways to do
And even do D&D.
it.
You
Yeah,
know,
it's painful because, we don't want to have that create the legitimizing feature that it has played historically. See, my generic game is fine. It can do D&D, right?
well,
But still, it's it's
it,
got
I mean,
legitimate grounding in that kind of play.
oh, for
Yeah.
sure. I think that my pit or, why it, I think one of the reasons why it works so well for me is it's sort of like, well, it's just a role playing game.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, one
Like,
of
how
the
else are you gonna don't overthink it? It's just a role playing game, and it works like that
Mhm.
pretty straightforwardly.
I think so too.
Uh,
Um, I have more questions about dice dynamics, but I think it's your turn.
So, um, have you had issues with? And I think maybe the answer is yes, based on some of the comments I've seen in kind of watching some of the videos and the comments I've seen. But maybe like my question is, maybe you could talk about this. Have you had issues with players kind of pre-narrating too much of the outcome prior to rolls?
That goes back to that roll with Hyver that I was talking about, with the
Yeah.
explosion. Um, well, this is a big topic, and it's actually a central piece of one of the sessions in the upcoming class. And I
Okay.
actually talked a little bit about it in some of the last dialogue, in the latest dialogue about the pool, in the latest comments, for the actual play posts. Specifically, my take is that when, oh geez, where do I start? Okay, if we look at what I call intent,
Mm-hmm.
it's part of the IIEE construction, and those are referring to the characters or other active entities in the fiction.
Right.
What
Right.
they're doing, what their trajectory of activity is taking them toward, nothing to do with what I want to happen or where I want this to go. Um, Now, I know, I mean, you can read what I wrote about this. I'm well aware that the characters don't exist and the players do. I get that. But we are specifically talking about it in terms of it as stated as fiction.
Mm-hmm.
So, with all the constraints on that this particular group cares to have, what the character would know or would do or anything like that, whatever. So, you have all this stated, you know, as what or obvious to the point where a moment's dialogue instantly identifies it, with no stress.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that you really don't need much more. You can add more about how they initiate their actions. That's kind of optional. You can take it a little farther into that. Like you're like, when I'm running over those rocks and I'm jumping on the guy and I'm stabbing him repeatedly, but once you start getting into more specific actions, the way I see it is the more provisional it gets.
Yeah, that makes
So
sense.
that the person who speaks at the end, whoever that person ends up being, success or failure, they can kind of decide where the cutoff is between statement and provision. They can kind of choose somewhere in that chain. Well, you know what you said about stabbing repeatedly? You never get there. Or the person speaking can say, and on the third stab, you know.
Right. Right.
So it's perfectly okay to let the speaker, because all that's really required is that. Um,
Okay.
Interestingly enough, If we take it from the point of view of the person speaking after the roll is made, all they're responsible for is actually stating the execution of the things that resolve the conflict. They
Right,
don't
right.
really have to fill in much of the gap unless they want to.
That makes sense.
And they
Yeah.
don't have to state much more about its impact into the next part of play more than they want to.
Yeah.
The next question of how much backstory authority do they get can, as in the document that you and I are using,
Right.
examples are given where a thing is actually introduced that wasn't there before.
Yeah.
It's an interesting question. And the rules really are provisional, as I say, and I think that that's a lot of room for an individual group to decide how they want to do that. But that's kind of, again, I've moved into talking about the monologue or the narration because it's those two things interrelate, right? How we talk about
Yep.
things going into the role and how we talk about it once the role is made. Those two things are, interrelate. So they kind of have to both be brought up. But they're both flexible. This one flexible about how much initiation do we get into,
Hmm.
and the other one about how much initiation prior to this execution do I fill in.
Right.
Right, that initiation part is extremely flexible in terms of how much gets said and who says it and in what direction. And I think that's a good thing.